welcome to another Education is Possible. This is Jordan,
I'm Sam.
and we're here today with Dr. Rae Leeper. Rae, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you guys?
Doing okay.
Making it through
So,
the cold.
yeah, yeah. So, Rae, if you could just start by taking us through what disability studies is when it intersects with education.
Sure. So historically in schooling, the traditional framework of working with students with disabilities comes from a special education model. And special education is really rooted in a medical framing of disability, which understands disability to sort of live in the person or the individual or the child themselves. And so the way this plays out is that, for example, for kids to qualify to receive services in special education, they have to score within a particular range on an assessment, right? And that assessment is normed based on like typical child development and atypical child development. And so within a traditional special education framework, the work in education is really focused on changing the child themselves. And so the goal is to sort of work to remediate that individual person's difference. And progress is measured based on that individual becoming closer and closer to like a mythical normal sort of range of expression, development, etc. And disability studies takes on more of a social model of disability, which really makes a distinction between disability and impairment. And so impairment is maybe an individual's has a vision impairment or a mobility impairment, right? Where they may need a wheelchair or access to Braille, but that the structural inequity really comes from a society, or in this case, a school, that refuses to plan for different ways of being in a classroom, different ways of learning, different means of expression. And so when access is not built in for students with disabilities, that's where the inequity comes from, not from the individual themselves. And so, from a disability studies perspective, the work is on school systems, is on pedagogy, and on teachers' practices to really, it's up to us to change to support all different kinds of learners versus the onus being on individual children themselves to change to fit into a normative structure of schooling. I should also add that I think an important conception that comes from a more social model of disability is this idea of temporarily able-bodied, which I find that is like a helpful and important mindset shift for a lot of teachers that I work with. And so it's this idea that disability is an expected aspect of human experience. And that if those of us who identified currently as able-bodied, meaning not somebody who's disabled, that that is likely a temporary state. And over the course of our lifetime, we all will experience an aspect of disability as we age or life circumstance impacts our lives. And so that it's really beneficial to all of us to really think about access for people with disabilities in all structures of our society, especially schooling, because it's not something that's a like it's not something that's on the fringe. It really is something that we need to plan for and is sort of an expected form of expression, of human expression.
So you've already touched on some of these like larger frameworks of like disability justice in a sense, but what does it look like for education to be a force for disability justice?
So disability justice evolved sort of out of so disability studies, I think, comes from a more tradition of rights-based framework of thinking about activism. And so in the United States, sort of advocating for legal protections, which are really, really important, but sometimes do very little to help complicate understandings of intersectionality. And so disability justice was formed by disabled people, specifically disabled people of color, often gender nonconforming disabled people, to really think about disability in the context of other identities, disability as an intersectional way of thinking about justice and liberation. And so thinking about disability and race, disability and gender, in our current context, thinking about the militarization of ICE as being like an issue for the disability community. And I think central to disability justice is this idea of interdependence versus independence. So I think in capitalist American society, there's this hyper fixation on this myth of independence. Like that's the goal for children, right? Is to be independent. I come from an early childhood background. There's a huge emphasis on this idea of independence for young children. Um, when in reality, we live very interdependent lives where we support each other, we live in communities. And for in disability justice, that's the goal, is really building networks of care, webs of care. And so how does disability justice look in a classroom? I think classrooms that are really working hard to create communities of care where children care for one another versus communities of competition. I think that is explicitly something tied to disability justice. Curriculum that looks at issues from an interdisciplinary and intersectional understanding, including centering the experiences of disabled people and disabled activists. If a social studies unit is going to talk about change makers, how are we like really forefronting the work of disabled activists in that? And and also highlighting the ways that, for example, historically disability rights groups worked hand in hand with like the Black Panthers. Like these have been historically very intersectional movements. Um, so presenting that in a more complex way, even for really young children, I think is really, really important. And I think helping kids challenging this notion of scarcity, I think is also really, really important. So this idea that like everyone can get what they need, but that might look very different for different kids in the classroom. I think that can be really challenging sometimes for teachers where they feel like every kid needs the same thing and like maybe it's not fair that a certain kid moves around in a different way than another kid. But there's ways in which we can explain and center the needs of kids in our classrooms where kids are really smart and they are able to hold those complicated understandings of needs and equity. I think also teachers seeing parents as colleagues is really essential. Often school systems, especially in sort of special education settings, can sometimes frame families as problems. And often that's because families are advocating for their kids in ways that make schools spend money and follow laws that sometimes are expensive or complicated. Teachers really seeing themselves as aligned with parents and families as colleagues versus as adversarial, I think is also really helpful to challenge these hierarchies of schools and families.
Yeah, you've given like so many great examples of how education can be a force for disability justice. Thinking about the opposite, when are schools, educational policies, etc., when are schools, educational policies, things of that nature, ableist?
Unfortunately, there's like kind of a long list of examples because I think sort of a disability justice notion of schooling uh, is not mainstream, and I think it's harder to locate examples of that. Structural ableism is, I would say, like in the air we breathe. So schools are just one expression of that. I don't think schools are unique in that way. I think one of the ways that it shows up very distinctly is in the way that schools and classrooms understand behavior and behavior management. So having sort of punitive responses to sort of out of norm expressions of reactions to classrooms isolative responses to kids' behavior, like shame-based responses to kids' behavior. All of those things I think are really problematic and often compound challenges for kids. Segregation is a huge issue for kids with disabilities, meaning that kids with disabilities are often funneled into separate kinds of classrooms with separate kinds of instruction, and that instruction is often not at all age appropriate. And in New York, at least, specific kinds of educational settings, children cannot even graduate with a diploma that allows them to go on to secondary or higher education. So that is like a real structural inequity. Oftentimes, children of color are disproportionately placed in these more segregated settings compared to their white peers with the same disability distinction. I think also general education teachers seeing themselves as teachers who quote unquote like don't work with those kids, and those kids being kids with disabilities, teachers using really harmful language like high functioning or low functioning. And I'm saying this being someone who's like very pro teacher, being a teacher myself and understanding how challenging teaching is. And so this isn't a critique of teachers, but really a critique of systems that normalize this kind of language. This is a critique of systems, right? Not individual people. I've also heard kids referred to as like special ed kids or IEP kids or behavior kids. So that casual way in which ableism is normalized in lunchrooms and teacher meetings and hallways really affect the humanity of individual children. I think also an over-adherence to standardized testing is really harmful for kids with disabilities, especially because then kids with disabilities are framed from a school structural standpoint as a liability. And that is extremely harmful. And overall, like sort of a school system that adheres to traditional understandings of sort of tracking, right? Lumping kids into groups that are like sort of high reading groups, low reading groups. I think that really is harmful and does not lead to like classrooms feeling like places of belonging for lots of different kinds of kids.
You know, all of our struggles are bound up in each other because essentially everything you just said also applies to, yes, standardized testing is actually bad for everyone. Yes, segregating students is harmful. And of course, it's disproportionate, but it it is not a good practice. And so for folks who are interested in exploring disability studies in education more, where can they look, both in terms of examples of this thriving in educational spaces and in terms of what's a good book to read? And I would encourage you all to certainly one good place to start is Rae's award-winning dissertation.
I want to start with like classroom practices that I think are really like I want to empower teachers to be change makers in any setting that they're in. And I think sometimes these structural inequities can feel so big that I want teachers to feel empowered that they can make minute by minute choices in their teaching and in their classrooms and in their communication with families that can make a huge difference for kids with disabilities, even in a broken system, even in a school where your principal doesn't know anything about supporting kids with disabilities or inclusion stance. Classrooms that really think about access for multilingual learners and for kids with disabilities as interdependent like sort of need areas and access areas is really, really important. So using UDL, Universal Design for Learning kinds of approaches, which means that you understand that kids construct and share meaning in lots of different ways. So that can mean artistic expressions, it can mean audio recording of things, written expressions of things, but allowing for different ways for kids to take in and share information, I think is really essential. Really thinking about curriculums that first center the needs of kids with disabilities and multilingual learners first instead of last. So like when we put kids first who have maybe the highest access needs, I really believe that like that's where really interesting curriculum can come from versus like I've created this standard curriculum for my average student or my above average student, and now I have to figure out all these exceptions. I don't think that that model really works for many people. I think that when kids with disabilities get what they need, it really helps every child in the classroom in an inclusive classroom because a lot of kids need the same kinds of things, but they're just kind of like quietly sitting and disassociating. I like getting away from this myth that like only kids with disabilities need multimodal learning. Like, no, all kids need multimodal learning. It's just certain kids can't access the curriculum without it, and other kids kind of mask it better. I think that classrooms can be places of joy and lightness and silliness, and classrooms should have open-ended time for kids to play and explore. And that doesn't have to be expensive and it doesn't have to have a lot of materials, but even 20 minutes in the day, and I mean that even for like fifth and sixth graders, it shouldn't just be early childhood kids, that they can draw and create and have Play-Doh and journal so that they have time to process and express themselves in different ways. Physical access is a huge issue in terms of like access to the bathroom, access to movement, access to like different kinds of seating arrangements. I can't tell you how many sort of escalated incidences I've seen that just started with a kid just asking to go to the bathroom and being told no, 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 and that like escalating to like physical intervention levels. And so like schools need to figure out how to have safe, unfettered access to the restroom and for kids to just be able to move around the classroom in a way that is not seen as a privilege, but just like a right. Like, how many of us can sit still for 7 hours and yet we expect kindergartners to sit for 45-minute lessons? So, so movement is a big thing, access to water, access to snacks. Like, these should all just be universal things that, again, all kids would really benefit from. But for kids who have sensory processing differences is really the difference of like I can pay attention or I can't. Like it is the light switch for access for them. And then I just want to explain like two little vignettes of schools that I feel like are really centering disability justice, and then I'll recommend some texts. One school that I think is doing some really beautiful work is a school here in New York City. Every classroom is an ICT classroom. And in New York, ICT is a model where there are two head teachers. One is a gen ed certified teacher and one is a special ed certified teacher. And in an ICT classroom, it's an inclusive classroom. So there's kids with IEPs and kids who do not have IEPs. First of all, I think this is like just a healthier model for teachers. Like, I think it's really hard to be a grown up by yourself all day with kids because you don't have other people to be like, did that go okay? Did that not go okay? Or like, this kid is getting into a power struggle with me. I need to switch, right? And we know that like kids bond with different kinds of grown-ups. So to have models where there's just one adult is is really hard, I think, for kids and for adults. And in this school, it's also a bilingual school, so it's Spanish and English. So that expression of like of understanding disability justice as intersectional, I think the school really epitomizes that. So it really thinks about access in terms of language and access in terms of disability access. And this is also a school where they spend half a day every week in Central Park, and it's a public school. It's also a school that has mixed ages, which I also think really is an inclusive model because it moves away from this rigid white European standard of child development where we have, decided because of men 150 years ago that children should do this skill at this age, right? And if they don't, then they're somehow behind. And so I think a mixed age classroom allows for kids to develop in a little bit more expansive way, and also allows kids to have strengths in literacy that they maybe don't have in math, right? So that they're not lockstep in this sort of expectation of grade level. So I think in this classroom also has time for play and for art. The kindergarten classroom has a puppet theater in the corner. And this is a public school that doesn't have like magical access to PTA money. That is a really, it's not perfect, but it's a really, when you go into that school, you really feel the humanity of kids being centered.
What's
Sorry,
it
go ahead.
called? What's the
Castlebridge?
school? Ca-
Castlebridge?
Castlebridge. Cool.
Yeah, it's in Washington Heights in Manhattan. And it's a teeny tiny school. I think there's like 2 classrooms per grade. It's also a school that has, in terms of disability justice, one of the things that they center is like thinking about collectivity instead of hierarchies. And so again, the school's not perfect, but the leadership are former teachers of the school, right? So there's this idea of really challenging traditional concepts of top-down approaches to running schools. And then there's this little small moment that has stuck with me that I saw when I was visiting one of my students in a classroom. This is a public school in New York City. I would say like an average public school in New York City, not like some of the public schools in New York City because of where they are and the PTA money kind of run more like fancy rich private schools, and this was not one of them. It was again an ICT class, so a gen ed and a special ed teacher. And it was a second grade class. There was a little kid who came in upset, like kind of crying, refusing to take his coat off, already like upset. And then over the course of the first 45 minutes of the day, he started getting more and more agitated. And one of the teachers in the room started like moving desks away from him, sort of preparing, I think, for a physical meltdown or something. He started getting more and more upset. He eventually grabbed this like box of fresh Crayola colored pencils. And I mention that because I think for teachers, we can get really precious with our stuff. And this was like a fresh box of Crayola color pencils. And he just started like snapping them, each one of them. And one of his teachers, like you could tell the tension in the room really grew, and all the adults, like you could feel it. And then the security guard appeared in the hallway. So I was really bracing for like, oh dear, this is going to be like a physical issue with this child, or this child's going to have to be physically touched or removed, which we know is really horrible. And it's also even more horrible in front of all of your peers, right? And this teacher looked at this child, and then I could see her make a choice. And she turned around and got another box of pencils and just put them on the desk. And the kid broke that box of pencils too. And then he just sat down and started crying. And the teacher like put her hand on his shoulder and said, like, do you want to step out? And he was like, yep. And he just like stood up, walked in the hallway. The counselor was there to support him. And it's like in that moment, she chose his humanity over like classroom materials, you know? And like we can all choose that. Like we can all choose to have a child, quote unquote, destroy $4 worth of supplies versus a piece of a kid's heart being like damaged at school, or for school to feel like a place where they are harmed. So those are two like moments or school structures where I feel like schools are and individual teachers are really working hard to prioritize disability justice in their classroom.
I would just be curious if you had any like one or two like book recommendations or anything. I work as a sub, and so I have had these experiences where the school doesn't know how to work with disabled children, and just recently had like a very severe like escalation kind of incident. And so I think those resources would be great, like not just for the audience, but like for me as well, as somebody
Yeah.
who's working within that structure and can't like make a ton of changes myself, but
Yeah.
still wants to like have some sort of impact.
Yeah, absolutely. I think first and foremost, I know for a lot of us, none of our educational experiences involved anything about disability, disability activism, disability leaders. So I think just like reading perspectives of disabled people, specifically disabled people of color, is really, really important. So Sins Invalid, who's like a collective queer artist organization that kind of was one of the starters of the concept of disability justice. Looking into their work is really essential. People like Mia Mingus and Leah Lakshmi Pepsa Samarasinha is an author who wrote this book called Care Work and another book called The Future is Disabled. Her concept of interdependence is, I think, really, really essential. The Disability Visibility podcast is amazing. Each podcast has like a different person being interviewed. And so, again, this isn't directly connected to like classroom approaches, but I think that like if you don't have any context for disability culture, then it's really hard to enact like equitable practices. It's important, like if we need to be culturally informed with our practices for disabled kids. And then in terms of books that are specific to classrooms, my colleague So Young Park just published a gorgeous book that is like very readable. It felt like a novel. It's called Reimagining Inclusion for Children of Color with Disabilities. And it really focuses on like individual choices of teachers in moments with young children of color, and also often young children of color who are multilingual, and like specific practices that these teachers have chosen to do that have really helped support kids in classrooms.